Well, it's obvious that Putin lives on a stream of lies, as it must be said, have most of his predecessors in the Kremlin. So lies have always been a weapon in the Kremlin armory, going back over several centuries. And in one sense, this is no different. But in another sense, of course, it's different because the stakes are so high. And one thing that since the beginning of the whole Ukraine tragedy has alarmed me, I think the Americans have played the rhetoric absolutely right, that they've given total support to Ukraine, enormous amount of weapons, but they've been very cautious about their rhetoric because they know that it's not a matter of playing with fire, we're playing with nuclear weapons, that we have a nuclear armed state on the other side. We all want the same outcome. We all want Putin to vanish from the Kremlin. We want the Russians to be thrown out of the Crimea and the Donbass. We want Russia to be paying for the £500 billion worth of damage that it's done to Ukraine. But against all this, we have to keep saying to ourselves, Russia is a nuclear armed state. One needs to mingle resolution and caution. So at the moment, I think the danger is very real, that if Putin feels cornered, that he will use some horrible weapon. And yes, he may be trying to work up to develop a pretext for doing just that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you what sort of Sergei Shoigu and Putin are playing at here. Is there any chance they're looking to escalate to de-escalate, or you think it is a bona fide risk of this turning nuclear or Russia using some other kind of weapons of mass destruction?
Having just published a book on the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, although one shouldn't push parallels too far, that one important parallel is that although intelligence in 1962 showed the Americans that the Russians had deployed ballistic missiles in Cuba, and although intelligence in February 2022 showed us that Russian troops were massing to invade Ukraine, intelligence is quite unable to tell us what's going on in the Kremlin, what's going on in Putin's mind. And I don't personally believe that President Biden or President Zelensky have any better idea than we do of what President Putin may be capable of. That there's daily, hourly speculation about whether Putin may fall. We just don't know. And that's one of the things that makes it very scary for Western leaders, that all the time they're having to grope, they're having to make decisions against a great fog of uncertainties. I personally think that there's probably not more than a 10 or 15% chance that the Russians will use some horrible weapon. But when you're dealing with something this awful, 10 or 15% is terrifyingly high.
Well, absolutely. And I know there are some analysts who think actually a lot of the focus has been on nuclear, but it's more likely Russia would go for chemical or radioactive weapons. What do you make of that?
I think it's perfectly plausible that the Russians would use a chemical or biological weapon. They're in big trouble with their conventional weapons. Their army is in total disarray. They've been humiliated on the battlefield. I've never believed that the Ukrainian army is going to be able to get the Russians out of the Donbass, out of the Crimea. But there's no doubt that the Russians are in deep trouble and the Russians are looking for a game changer. So it is perfectly plausible. And things that to us seem horrific, seem unthinkable, in the Russian mind, this is all about winning. They're absolutely determined not to face the humiliation. And what's even more frightening is that, yes, that there is evidence that support for Putin inside Russia is slipping. But it is terrifying what a significant proportion of the Russian people still support Putin, because they do believe that there is a Western conspiracy to humiliate them, and they do believe that Ukraine rightly belongs with Russia. Now, we may think that this is a ludicrous narrative. For a start, it takes no heed at all of the wishes of the Ukrainian people. But that's true of almost everything that the Russians do throughout history. Orlando Figes has just published a very good new book called The Russia Story, which is not the history of Russia. What it is a history of how Russia has continuously through the centuries reinvented itself and invented a narrative about itself. And this narrative has almost always involved demanding a unilateral right to say where the rightful frontiers of Russia lie. And that's the scary part. And there is no sign that President Putin today has retreated from his determination to set the frontiers of Russia where he chooses. And he may be prepared to use some horrible weapons in order to achieve this. So I believe that the right message from the West, and I do think the Americans are doing this absolutely right, is to show a mixture of resolution in absolute commitment to Ukraine, but also caution, recognizing that Russia has all these terrifying weapons and is a sufficiently horrible state to be willing to use them.
Do you think that the UK is getting the balance right at the moment in terms of what we're projecting?
No, I absolutely don't. I think British politicians have displayed much less sensitivity than American ones in their rhetoric. That we've had very senior British politicians, Truss, Ben Wallace and so on, saying publicly that the war must go on until the last Russian is out of the Crimea and the Donbass, that this is not our war. The idea that the British people are prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian, this is the Ukrainians' war, it's the Ukrainians' choices. Yes, we've done absolutely the right thing by giving them all the military assistance within our power. But if you look at the numbers, that our military aid may be more than most European countries, except Poland, I think. But on the other hand, it's still a tiny fraction of what the Americans have given. And one thing I think the British people and the Europeans generally have not sufficiently taken into account, this crisis, this tragedy, has shown for the 100th time since World War II that the Americans are absolutely key to the leadership of the West in any serious crisis. Without the Americans, President Zelensky and his country would today be toast. If Ukraine was totally dependent upon all the aid that we can give, we've almost exhausted our inventory of weapons that are relevant to this struggle. It's the Americans who are keeping the Ukrainians going. And yes, we're doing everything, sorry, yes, we're doing everything in our power to help the Ukrainians, and absolutely rightly so. But we should recognize how modest is our contribution compared with the Americans. European people should show more open gratitude to the Americans for their backing, because we may yet have another Trump clone in the White House, Trump or somebody like him in 2024, who would not give this sort of support. And it's terrifying to contemplate the fact that we who are so ill-armed should have to face the Russians, or for that matter the Chinese, unless we had the Americans behind us. So I think we should be displaying far more gratitude to the Americans for what they've done, and be more cautious in our own rhetoric. And I'm afraid, I do think that some British politicians have exploited the Ukrainian conflict for their own political ends. And I think it's a very ugly sight to see British politicians using much more bellicose rhetoric than Americans do. And I personally believe it's because they're embattled at home and they're seeking to gain credit for their support for Zelensky. And that's not pretty. We're accustomed in peacetime for our politicians to treat words as cheap. But as soon as you get a situation this grave, and this is one of the gravest crises to strike Europe in my lifetime, then you should be weighing every word with a care that I'm not convinced that some British politicians are doing.
That's interesting. I mean, do you think that there is any appetite in Kyiv to eventually come to some sort of resolution that involves giving up either Crimea or the Donbass? Because I think a lot of the rhetoric in defence of UK politicians that I hear is that, Ukraine shouldn't be pressured by the West or by the United States into giving up some of its sovereign territory.
I think both these assertions are true, that the West certainly shouldn't be bringing pressure to bear. Where we have to start is thinking, what is Putin's game at the moment? And the answer is, he's convinced that the will of his regime and of Russia is stronger than that of the West. What he's looking for is this winter, as soon as the rains and the snow get serious and people start seeing the lights going off, that Western will crumble. Now, our first job is to show that he's wrong about that. We have to display a degree of unity in Europe above all, and we have to show a degree of resolution which Putin does not believe that we possess. So that's the first part. But I also believe that the war, I'm afraid, and the killing and the dying have got to go on for quite some time before there can be any possibility of any sort of negotiation. On the one hand, one can say, which again, some people in Britain who should know better forget, all wars end in conversations. Of course, they're conversations in different terms, but this war is likely to end up in some sort of conversation. I don't think it will end tidily. One of the things we need to be thinking about now, I believe, is that even if there is some sort of deal to stop the shooting in the short term, the one thing that's almost certain is that even if Putin falls, he'll be succeeded by somebody equally unpleasant. And the Russians will try again in Ukraine. They've shown their hand, they've declared their determination to absorb Ukraine, and therefore Ukraine will have to live under the threat of Russian aggression. What are we going to do to provide Ukraine with guarantees that will prevent the Russians from doing that? Now, a very obvious answer is that the Russians should have to pay a price for what they've done, and that price should be that Ukraine joins NATO. But the French and the Germans, to name but two, would be appalled by any notion of that kind, and it would pose huge problems. But I do think we should be discussing that issue. It's not just a question of where the front line is when the shooting stops. It's a question of how do we stop the Russians from doing this again tomorrow or next year or in a couple of years. And that's a very difficult problem, but we ought to be facing it. Now, I personally think, and I've been accused of being an appeaser and a defeatist for saying this, that I should be amazed if when this ends, we all want to see Russia, and natural justice demands that Russia is kicked out of the Crimea, for instance. I personally don't believe that's going to happen because I don't believe the Ukrainian army can achieve it. And I think the Russians might indeed be prepared to do horrible things in order to prevent that. So I think one has to keep an open mind about where this ends. But of course, it's also right, it has to be the Ukrainians who make the decision on where this ends. But there are huge problems that an American writer I respect, sorry, an American writer I respect wrote in Foreign Affairs a few months ago that one of his fears was that even if the Russians can't defeat Ukraine militarily, what they can do is make Ukraine a horrible, almost unviable country to live and work in. And of course that could well be a Russian objective if they give up on battlefield victory. But I'm afraid the bad news, above all for the Ukrainian people, is that the killing and the dying are likely to go on for a good long while yet before either side is willing to acknowledge that there's got to be some sort of deal or arrangement or armistice or whatever you want to call it.
So you think we are potentially only in the foothills of this conflict? It doesn't seem to you like there's a likelihood of resolution anytime soon?
I do not believe there will be any early resolution of this conflict. It's going to go on for a long time. It's a horrible business. And I say the biggest challenge, Western democracies' attention spans are terrifyingly short. And this is what Putin is gambling on. Putin invaded Ukraine because he believed that the West is weak. He believed that we lack the will to stop him. Well, our foremost task this winter is to show a resolution that Putin believes that we lack.
Let's focus in for a moment on Vladimir Putin and his psychology. I'm interested, you say in many ways the West is groping in the dark regarding Putin and what he's thinking. What do we know about his psychology, his ideology, what he'll be weighing up at the moment regarding both the population, what the Russian elites are thinking, and some of the more nationalistic pro-war tendencies who seem pretty angry about how badly the war is going on Russia's behalf?
One thing I find pretty scaring, in 1962, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world thought that Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, was deranged and dangerous. Well, we now know, having had access to the recordings and to records, what we now know, having had access to testimony about what took place in the Kremlin during the missile crisis, is that Khrushchev was far more rational than we supposed at the time, and that Western leaders supposed at the time, that from the moment John F. Kennedy broadcast to the American people in the world, saying that the missiles had got to leave Cuba, privately, Khrushchev realized that he was going to have to give in. He realized that the alternative was thermonuclear war, which the Soviet Union certainly couldn't win. Now, he kept the world in a state of terror for a week after that because he refused to admit to the world that he'd reached that conclusion. But we know that he had an absolutely clear-sighted view of the limits of how far he could push this thing. Well, now today, I personally believe, and I've said in my book, that I think that Putin is a less rational player than was Khrushchev. He doesn't have that presidium in the Kremlin to whom he's answerable. He has this group of cronies. Russia is a gangster culture. It's led by this sort of Al Capone figure. And he doesn't appear to be answerable to anybody other than the fellow gangsters around him. And there's no process of critical debate. And so none of us know. We're all guessing about what's going on. But Putin appears obsessed with a legacy, with his legacy being to have created a new Soviet empire, to have extended the boundaries of the Russian Federation. And he appears to be willing to go to any lengths. He's already presided over the deaths of tens of thousands of people in order to pursue this, in our eyes, deranged ambition. I'm afraid there seems to be almost no limit to where he's prepared to take it. Now, there's a lot of speculation, none of us know, about Putin's possible fall. The worry is that it's possible, at least, that he could be succeeded by an ultra-nationalist who proves worst. What he's unlikely to be succeeded by is a new Gorbachev figure, some sort of liberal who has clear-sighted, decent ideas about Russia's place in the world. The problem with wars, and this is where this crisis is more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, in 1962 almost nobody died. Yes, there was the threat of a big power war which would have devastated the planet. The threat was there of general war between the Soviet Union and the United States, but only a handful of people had died. Now today we're already in the middle of a war and tens of thousands of people have died. This makes it more difficult to see the way out, that President Kennedy knew that Khrushchev did have a sort of legal case for putting his missiles in Cuba, based on the fact that there was no more reason in law why Castro shouldn't invite the Russians to put missiles in Cuba than there was for the Americans to put their missiles in Turkey or Italy or Britain. Today is different. Today Putin has no shadow of a legal case, and this makes it far more difficult to see how we get out of this, because you can't look, it's so difficult to define a bargain. And the only people in the end who are going to be able to define this bargain are Zelensky. And there is so much bitterness now, and God knows, understandable bitterness. And Putin, I don't think he's mad. I mean, he's no more or less mad than was Stalin or some of the other dictators. But he does seem obsessive. He does seem to have no checks on his power. And perfectly obviously by his actions, he's shown that he has no moral compass whatsoever. He is obsessed with this mad pan-Slav vision for Russia. And the only way to resist, I say, it's this mixture of resolution in resisting him, but also extreme caution, recognizing that Russia has these terrifying weapons.
Is Putin coming under any significant pressure from those gangsters, the oligarch class? Surely it's bad for business, sanctions, and the chill factor of their ability to move wealth and themselves move, with their families, their assets around the West.
Where it behoves all of us, or most of us, to be extremely cautious in what we say now, is that a year ago, if somebody had said to me, will Russia invade the Ukraine, I would have said no, because it was so obvious that such an act would do such devastating damage to Russia. So all logic said that the Russians wouldn't do this, and yet they've done it, and Putin has done it. And so we can see very clearly that Putin is operating by an entirely different logic from our logic. And I think this is what makes it so difficult. And I say my only very strong guess, I don't believe that the CIA or Britain's SIS or President Biden or whatever passes for a government in Britain have any better idea than we do sitting here about what Putin may do or not do. All we have to do, which is very important, or two things. One is the White House has to signal privately, in the clearest terms to the Kremlin, about the sort of consequences that would follow any sort of nuclear use by the Russians. I mean, it would not be credible to threaten Russia with a nuclear strike on Russia. But on the other hand, what one can threaten is the use of American conventional weapons to destroy the Black Sea Fleet or take out key Russian installations. And it seems terribly important that those sort of private, secret warnings are being given to Russia, and we have to hope and assume that those warnings are being given. But it's the bad news always in crises. You do not want to be unpredictable. You want to signal your intentions as clearly as possible to the other side. And so we have to make plain, the West has to make plain what the West's red lines in the defence of Ukraine are. And I think this is being done, and I have great respect for the way the Americans have handled this crisis. I read a huge amount of the American published material by authoritative Americans, and I think they're being far more realistic and far more sensible than some of the commentators, certainly in Britain.
And just finally, you talk about the West being clear in its red lines and how things could escalate if Russia resorts to using nuclear weapons or other weapons beyond the pale. How much is it the case that we understand, or how clear is Russia's nuclear doctrine compared to the Cold War?
In the Cold War, the West had a pretty clear idea of what the Russian doctrine, what the Russian strategy and policy was. And this is why a lot of Western commanders and Western leaders today feel a sort of nostalgia that would have been unthinkable 50 or 60 years ago for what they call the adversarial certainties of the Cold War. Today we're dealing with a completely unpredictable new situation. It's very, very hard to predict how Putin will interpret his own interests. Everything is about him. It's not really about Russia, or yes, it's about his vision of Russia, but it's all so much focused on this one man, and he does have all these horrible people behind him. So I think predicting the next phase in this crisis is more difficult than it was during some of the crises of the Cold War. So, thank you, Lucy.